Callum's fingers gripped the smoking remains of his cockpit as he stumbled out into the unknown jungle, his breath ragged from the crash. His ship was beyond repair, the distress beacon shattered. The air was thick with humidity, and towering bioluminescent trees stretched high into the alien sky, casting an eerie blue glow across the landscape. "Well, this is just perfect," he muttered, brushing sweat and ash from his face. His survival training kicked in: find shelter, assess the environment, locate potential threats. But before he could take another step, the jungle fell silent. A low, guttural growl came from the underbrush. Callum barely had time to react before something massive emerged from the foliage. A giant alien woman, at least 13 feet tall, stepped into view. Her muscular frame was wrapped in minimal, intricately woven armor, her deep blue skin adorned with glowing tribal tattoos. Cat-like eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent his survival instincts into overdrive. Hey! Callum raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The alien tilted her head, her lips curling into something between curiosity and amusement. Then, before he could react, she moved. Fast. Too fast. A powerful hand gripped his arm, hoisting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Callum yelped, kicking instinctively, but her grip was unshakable. "Oh, hell no! Put me down!" She didn't understand his words, but she certainly understood his struggle. A deep, rumbling chuckle escaped her throat. Then, to his utter horror and confusion, she slung him over her shoulder like a sack of supplies. "What the? No, 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 this is not happening." The towering alien let out something that sounded suspiciously like purring as she carried him off into the jungle. Callum realized, with dawning horror, that he had just been claimed. The jungle trek. The world bounced up and down as Callum was carried effortlessly through the dense alien jungle. 13 feet of pure muscle had no issue maneuvering through thick foliage, her long strides covering ground that would have taken Callum hours. "Okay, maybe we got off on the wrong foot," Callum said, shifting against her iron grip. "I come in peace? That's a thing, right? Peace?" She grunted, clearly uninterested in whatever he had to say. From his awkward vantage point, hanging over her shoulder like a prize, he got a closer look at her. The tattoos along her arms and shoulders glowed faintly, pulsing in a rhythmic pattern. There was something almost regal about her, from the intricate bone and metal adornments on her armor to the way she carried herself. Callum's mind raced. Was she part of a warrior tribe? A hunter? A queen? More importantly, was she going to eat him? "Look, I appreciate the hospitality and all, but I'd really rather walk." His protests went ignored. It wasn't long before they broke through the jungle and into a massive settlement. Towering structures, built from a mix of stone and jungle wood, stretched across a vast clearing. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of giant alien women turned as they approached, their feline-like eyes narrowing in curiosity. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Callum's captor hoisted him higher, displaying him proudly like a trophy. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Callum groaned. The alien warrior woman said something in her deep, commanding voice, and the crowd reacted instantly. Some laughed. Others hissed in what sounded like disapproval. A few warriors stepped forward, eyeing Callum with dangerous intrigue. One particularly large warrior woman, just as tall as his captor, but with scarred arms and a wicked-looking spear, stalked forward. She gestured to Callum and said something sharp. Callum had no idea what was being said, but he recognized a challenge when he saw one. "Oh, hell no. I am not a prize to be fought over." His captor's grip on him tightened. Then, without warning, she slammed her fist against her chest and let out a roar. The scarred warrior grinned, slamming her own chest in response. Callum's stomach dropped. They weren't arguing. They were about to fight. Over him. The tension in the air was palpable as the two massive women faced off. Callum, still slung over his captor's shoulder like an oversized duffel bag, stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before him. The scarred warrior woman, who was every bit as imposing as his captor, bared her teeth in a predatory grin. Her spear gleamed under the jungle sun, a deadly extension of her body. The crowd of warriors murmured, some stepping back to give the fighters space, while others leaned in eagerly. A low growl rumbled from the giant woman carrying Callum, her muscles coiling with tension. She held him tighter against her side, her other hand flexing as though readying herself for a fight, but not with her hands. She was ready to fight with everything. Okay, let's all just take a deep breath, huh? Callum tried to reason, wiggling uncomfortably against the strong grip of the alien warrior. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm really not a... Before he could finish his sentence, the warrior women charged. The thundering clash of their bodies as they collided sent a shockwave through the clearing. Callum flinched, realizing that this was not some kind of playful wrestling match. No, these women were fighters, and they were about to see which one could claim him. Skari, his captor, and apparently the one defending her claim over him, ducked under a brutal swing of the scarred woman's spear. With a primal roar, she swept forward, her hands gripping her opponent's wrists and slamming them into the ground with terrifying precision. Callum's heart raced in his chest as he realized just how much strength the woman holding him possessed. He shifted again, trying to free himself, but Skari's hold was unrelenting, and she gave him a warning glare when he made another attempt to escape. "You're not going anywhere," she growled. Callum swallowed his protest. There was no way he could take on these women in a fight. He was a pilot, not a gladiator. He wasn't even sure if they were going to let him leave this place alive. Skari's opponent managed to push back, kicking her legs out and forcing Skari to stumble. The scarred woman launched herself to her feet, eyes narrowing as she prepared for another assault. Callum noticed the sharp predatory focus in her eyes. This wasn't just about the fight. No, the prize was him. He wanted no part in this, but as much as he struggled against the situation, there was little he could do. The fight between the two warriors raged on, each blow exchanged with brutal force, their bodies slamming into the jungle floor and sending up clouds of dust and foliage. A few of the watching women cheered as the combatants exchanged powerful blows. One of them, who was significantly smaller and seemingly less involved in the brawl, stepped closer to Callum. She reached out to touch his arm, staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Human." He blinked, not sure if he should respond to the woman's soft-spoken question. The word sounded more like an observation than a query. Yeah, I'm human," Callum answered cautiously, his voice quieter than before. "And this is getting way out of hand. Can't we just..." The smaller woman's eyes narrowed as she listened to the fight intensify behind her, a deep rumbling growl joining the sounds of the combat. "She claims you. You are hers now." Callum felt his stomach flip. Was this a cultural thing? Did they fight for dominance in a bizarre ritual? It was clear now that Skari was not simply some rogue warrior. She was the one who had captured him, and in their eyes that made her his owner. At least that was what the combat was all about. She was fighting for the right to keep him. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't a "hey, I want you to stick around" situation. This was a fight for ownership. Skari's battle with the scarred warrior woman continued with ferocity, but she was beginning to gain the upper hand. With a sudden, earth-shattering twist, she threw her opponent off balance, knocking the spear from her hands. The scarred woman struggled to regain her footing, but Skari was already on top of her, one powerful knee on her chest, pinning her to the ground. The crowd of warriors fell silent, waiting for the verdict. Skari breathed heavily, her glowing tattoos pulsing brightly against the chaos of the fight. She glared down at the scarred woman beneath her, as if daring her to challenge the claim any further. The scarred woman, breathing heavily and with no strength left to fight, let out a defeated sigh. "She wins." Callum blinked in surprise. Was it really that easy? The fight was over just like that? He had no time to process it before Skari stood, lifting him up effortlessly and holding him in front of her chest. Her golden eyes locked onto him, intense and unwavering. "You are mine," she stated firmly, her voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. Callum's stomach dropped. There it was again. He was hers. The thought made him uncomfortable, his mind racing to figure out how to escape this bizarre situation. Look, Lady, Callum began, swallowing hard as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. I'm not your prize. I'm not. Skari's gaze softened for a split second, as if something about his frustration touched her in some way. She reached down and touched his cheek with her massive hand, her rough fingers surprisingly gentle. You are more than a prize, she said, her voice low and surprisingly tender. You are now my responsibility. Callum could only stare at her, his mind reeling from the impossible situation he had found himself in. He wasn't sure if that was a threat or something more profound, but the one thing he did know was that he was now part of something much bigger than himself. The clearing, once filled with raucous noise, was now eerily quiet. The other warriors stood at a respectful distance, their eyes flicking back and forth between Callum and the defeated alien woman still kneeling on the ground. Skari, her chest heaving with exertion, continued to hold him in a vice-like grip, her gaze never leaving the woman she had just bested. She will not challenge me again, Skari said firmly, her voice a low growl that brooked no argument. The scarred warrior, still panting, nodded curtly and stood. She shot Callum a final glare before retreating to the crowd, where whispers began to ripple through the onlookers. He couldn't understand the words, but the sentiment was clear. Skari had claimed him, and the others had to accept it. Callum tried to ignore the feeling of being a prize and instead focused on his immediate surroundings. He was far from his ship now, and in his current state, escaping wasn't exactly a viable option. His hands, still tied by the thick alien fabric of his flight suit, felt stiff and useless. He had no weapons, no tools, nothing. Skari's eyes, sharp and calculating, finally turned back to him. She studied him as though he were something to be dissected. Human, she repeated, her voice softer than before. There was something new in her tone, something that wasn't just command but a strange fascination. Callum flinched at the word but quickly recovered, trying to keep his composure. Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not your property. His voice came out louder than he intended, though the words sounded more like a plea than a command. Skari's lips curled into a small smile, though there was no humor in it. You misunderstand, human. Her massive hand brushed the back of his neck gently, and for a moment, he thought he could feel a connection. A pulse, almost like something electrical passing between them. You are mine by bond, not by force, she continued, her voice as steady as the ground beneath their feet. On this planet, the claim between two beings is made not with chains, but with connection. And you, she said, narrowing her eyes, have just started the bond. Before Callum could ask what she meant, she turned her back to him and gave a low whistle. The warriors surrounding the clearing began to move, breaking up into groups and returning to their tasks. Some of them, however, lingered near the edges, watching Callum with a kind of calculating intensity. What's happening here? Callum asked, a knot of unease growing in his stomach. I'm not staying here. I can't be part of whatever this is. Skari turned her head back to him with a tilt of her chin. You are not free to leave, human. Not until you understand your place in this world. Not until the bond is complete. She didn't wait for his response before she turned again and began to lead him deeper into the jungle. The dense undergrowth seemed to part before her, as if the very trees and vines knew to move for the warrior woman. Callum had no choice but to follow her, his legs struggling to keep up with her long strides. She was moving with purpose now, her movements fluid, almost predatory, as if everything in her world was already accounted for. Where are we going? Callum asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he wouldn't like the answer. We are going to my home, Skari replied, not looking back at him. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of something unfamiliar in her words. There, you will learn what it means to be claimed. Callum couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. Learn? I didn't sign up for any of this. You have no choice, human. Her words were final, and it hit him with the weight of truth, at least in the context of this strange alien world. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Callum tried to process everything that was happening. He had crash-landed on an unknown planet, only to be claimed by a warrior woman who seemed to view him as some kind of companion? property. Whatever it wasn't good. Arrival at Skari's home. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a massive structure. A towering edifice made of natural stone and wood, rising high above the trees. The architecture was strange and alien but beautiful in its own way, with intricate carvings of beasts and warriors covering the surface. The building seemed to blend seamlessly with the jungle, as if it had grown from the very land itself. Skari led Callum inside, through an open doorway flanked by towering columns that hummed with an unnatural energy. As they entered, the air was filled with the sounds of rustling fabric and murmurs in a language he couldn't understand. He saw several other women, all of them tall, imposing figures engaged in various tasks. Cooking, crafting, sharpening weapons. Their eyes flicked to him, then back to their work, showing no surprise at his presence. It was as if they were used to seeing a human among them. They entered a large central hall, with a fire burning in the center and mats spread out along the floor. Skari set Callum down on one of the mats, her hands still gripping him firmly as though he might escape at any moment. "This is where you will stay, for now." Skari's voice was more solemn now, a quiet understanding in her tone. "Until the bond has been fully completed, you are part of this world. Part of my world." Callum's stomach twisted as the reality of his situation settled over him. He was trapped. He could leave the planet, but he knew now that doing so would be far more complicated than simply walking away. Skari settled beside him, her sharp eyes always scanning the room, never relaxing. For the first time, Callum realized the weight of her position in this world. This wasn't just about him anymore. There were other forces at play, other expectations. "You're not just some alien warrior," Callum muttered, glancing at her side. "You're a leader, aren't you?" Skari looked at him, her eyes softening for the briefest moment before returning to their usual, unyielding intensity. "I am, and so are you now." Callum swallowed. He was no one's leader, but the idea that he was now tied to this world, to her, was growing increasingly real. He glanced around the hall again. "I'm not going to just sit here," Callum said, his voice firm. "I want to understand this world, your culture, whatever the hell is going on here. You can't just claim me and expect me to accept it." Skari's eyes gleamed. "We'll see, human. We'll see." The days that followed were an endless blur of strange customs and harsh lessons. Callum's initial resistance faded to a simmering frustration as he was dragged deeper into the heart of Skari's world. He was not allowed to leave, not yet, not until the bond was fully forged. He had no choice but to follow along, to accept the strange rituals and customs that had now become his daily life. Each morning, he was summoned to train, his movements slow and clumsy as Skari forced him to engage in physical activities designed to teach him how to move like the warriors of her tribe. The training was grueling. His body, sore from hours of exercises, grew increasingly accustomed to the strange methods they used to fight, to survive. He had learned a few things about their combat styles, an emphasis on agility, power, and endurance, and the surprising fact that they fought with far more than just strength. It was as if they had perfected every technique, every motion, until each attack felt natural, like second nature. But what frustrated Callum the most wasn't the physical training. It was the constant reminder that he was bound to this place now. His status as a claimed human was ingrained in every moment. He was treated differently, more like a pet than a person, yet with a strange reverence. At first, Skari had insisted he wear the tribal garb of the warriors, woven fabrics that hung from his shoulders and tied around his waist. The material was durable like a second skin, but he hated it. Every time he caught his reflection in the rippling surface of the jungle's rivers, it only reminded him of his helplessness. His own mind seemed to be fighting an uphill battle against the physical strength that his captor had forced upon him. Despite his frustration, there were moments where Callum saw the human side of Skari, glimpses of something real, something more than just the fierce warrior who had claimed him. Late at night, when the firelight flickered low, she would sit beside him in silence, her eyes staring into the flames, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the alien symbols on her skin. He had learned that her markings weren't just decoration. They were the story of her life, a map of everything she had conquered, everything she had experienced. Skari's voice broke through the stillness one evening as they sat together by the fire. "Why do you resist, human?" Callum had grown tired of the question, of the way she always phrased it with such certainty. Still, he couldn't help but respond, a thread of bitterness lining his voice. "I'm not your possession. I'm not your trophy. I don't belong here." Her golden eyes flicked to him, an unreadable expression on her face. She didn't speak at first, just stared, almost as if she was measuring the weight of his words. Then she spoke, her voice low but commanding. "If you did not belong, you would not still be alive." The bluntness of the statement made Callum pause, but it didn't ease the anger gnawing at him. "So what, I'm just supposed to take this? Take you?" His words were sharper than he intended, and he knew it, but it didn't stop him. "What happens when the bond's complete? What do you do with me then?" Skari leaned forward, her posture tense, but there was no sign of hostility, just that cold, controlled demeanor that had marked every interaction so far. "When the bond is complete, you will be my equal." Callum blinked in confusion. Equal? The thought seemed absurd. "You and I are connected now, human." Skari's eyes softened for the first time in days. "The bond is more than physical. It is a soul connection. You belong to me, but you are not just mine. We are linked now in ways that go beyond simple possession." Her words made Callum pause. He wanted to argue, to say something cutting, but something about her expression made him hesitate. The way she spoke, so sure of her beliefs, so calm, he had no idea how to process it. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to process it. It didn't seem real. A soul connection? That was far beyond anything he had ever believed in. "And if I don't accept it?" Callum asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Skari tilted her head, her piercing gaze studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. "There is no question of accepting it, human. It is not a choice." Before Callum could respond, Skari stood abruptly, her powerful frame casting a long shadow over him. Her eyes never left him as she motioned for him to follow. He had come to understand that when she moved, there was no discussion. He had learned the hard way that resisting her commands was not an option. "Come, human." She reached down, effortlessly lifting him to his feet as though he weighed nothing. "There is more you must learn. The ritual of connection." They ventured into the heart of the jungle, where the towering trees grew thicker and the air grew warmer. Callum's legs ached from the constant motion, his mind still whirling with thoughts of escape, of freedom, but he kept his mouth shut. He had seen enough of this alien world to know that resistance wasn't just futile. It was dangerous. They arrived at a sacred clearing, a place Callum had only heard whispers about. In the center of the clearing was a stone circle, ancient and weathered, surrounded by a glow that wasn't of the natural world. The atmosphere was thick with the sense of something deep, something almost spiritual. Skari dropped to one knee beside the circle and turned to him. Her face was unreadable. "This is the site of the bond." She gestured to the stone floor. "It is here that we will become one." Callum took a step back, confusion and fear spreading through him. "What do you mean? What are you going to do?" Skari's golden eyes softened. "We must complete the connection. I have claimed you, and now the bond must be sealed. We will be connected for life, whether you accept it or not." For the first time, Callum felt a tremor of fear ripple through him. This was far beyond anything he could have anticipated. What kind of connection could they form? And what would happen if he didn't accept it? He stared at her, his chest tightening. "How do I know you're not just using me?" Skari's lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. "You will know soon enough, human." The air in the sacred clearing felt heavy, thick with an energy that Callum couldn't quite place. The ancient stone circle before him hummed, as though it had a life of its own. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find a way back to his ship and escape from this strange alien world. But the sight of Skari kneeling before him, her eyes locked onto his, held him in place. Her presence was like a gravitational pull, inescapable and all-consuming. Callum's body was tense, but he couldn't deny the fact that some part of him had grown used to her proximity. He had grown used to the way she commanded attention without even speaking, to the strange connection that had already begun to form between them. It wasn't just her physical dominance. There was something deeper at play here, something that tugged at the core of his being. "This is how it must be, human." Skari's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. Her words were gentle but resolute. "You may resist it, but the bond is already starting. What happens now will solidify it, make it real." Callum's throat felt dry as he swallowed, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What do you mean, solidify it? What do you want from me?" Her golden eyes shone with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Familiar, but unlike anything he'd ever seen before. "I want you to understand that this is not just my claim, human." She rose to her feet and took a step toward him. "It is ours. You belong to me, yes, but you are not a possession. You are now part of something much greater." Callum was almost paralyzed by the intensity of her gaze, but something in her words made his chest tighten. Part of something greater? What did that even mean? She reached out and placed her large hand gently on his chest, her touch warm, almost soothing despite the power she exuded. "I will show you, human." Her voice was barely a whisper now, the weight of her words settling between them like a slow, inevitable tide. "Come, sit with me." Callum hesitated, but then, almost without thinking, he sank to his knees beside her, the stone beneath him cool and solid. As soon as he sat, Skari moved to sit directly in front of him, her body so large it seemed to tower over him. Yet there was a softness in her eyes now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. She placed her hands on either side of his head, pulling him gently toward her, until their foreheads touched. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. A surge of heat, of power, of something deep and primal washed over him. Callum's breath caught in his throat as the world around him seemed to blur and distort. It was as if every cell in his body was being remade, reshaped by her presence, by her touch. For a moment he tried to pull away, panic gripping his chest. But Skari's hands were like iron bands, holding him steady. She didn't speak, but the pressure in his mind, in his soul intensified. And then it clicked. In the space between their minds, in the silence that stretched between heartbeats, Callum felt the bond form. It was not like anything he had ever experienced. It was not a contract, not a transaction. It was deeper than that, inescapable, woven into the very fabric of his being. She had been right. This wasn't just about her claiming him as some sort of trophy. This was about them becoming something unified, something inseparable. A vision flooded his mind. A landscape of towering mountains and endless jungles. A world unlike anything he had seen before, but one that felt so alive. It wasn't just the planet. It was her world, her people, her tribe. He could feel the pulse of the land beneath his feet, the hum of the ancient stones around them, the rhythms of life that had thrived here for eons. He could feel her heart, beating in time with his own. "Do you understand now?" Skari's voice echoed inside his mind, a soft caress that brought him back to himself. Callum blinked, struggling to process the flood of emotions, images, and sensations. I don't know. You do." She spoke again, but this time it was different. There was no more harshness in her tone, no more cold calculation. "This bond, this connection, it cannot be broken. Not by you, not by me. It is now part of us." The realization struck him like a punch to the gut. He had been fighting it, fighting her, fighting the idea of being bound to a tribal life he didn't understand. But now there was no fight left. He was part of it, whether he liked it or not. Skari withdrew her hands, and for a moment, the air between them felt empty, as though something was missing. But it wasn't fear he felt now. It was a calmness, a strange sense of completion. It wasn't the kind of peace he had imagined, but it was a peace nonetheless. She studied him, her golden eyes sharp, but there was a flicker of something else in them now, something softer, almost tender. "You will not leave. You belong to me, and now you understand why." Callum opened his mouth to respond, but words seemed to fail him. What could he say? How could he argue when his mind and body felt so entwined with hers, with her world? The bond is just the beginning, human. Skari's voice brought him back to reality. She rose to her full height, her presence towering over him. Now you must learn how to live within it. We have much to teach you, and you have much to learn. Callum didn't answer immediately. He looked up at her, seeing the warrior she was, the leader of her people, the one who had claimed him. And yet, beneath that exterior, something else pulsed. There was a depth to her, a history that went beyond the physical bond between them. He wasn't just her prisoner now. They were connected. I understand, he said finally, his voice steady, even though inside, he felt like everything was shifting. I understand. The air around them was thick with the bond that had just been forged, a silent hum that vibrated through every part of Callum's being. The jungle, once a terrifying unknown, now felt like an extension of his own body, as though he were connected to every leaf, every creature, every ripple of the wind. It wasn't something he had chosen, it had simply happened. And yet, there was no escaping it now. The bond was a living, breathing thing that had taken root deep inside him. Skari stepped back, her towering figure casting a long shadow over him. Her eyes never left his, though there was no harshness there now. Instead, there was a weight in her gaze, a weight of understanding, of acceptance. She wasn't the same woman who had claimed him in that first brutal moment. Something had shifted between them, something that neither could deny. You have been chosen. Her voice was low but resonant, almost like a command. Now, you will live as part of this world, not just as an outsider. Callum could feel the intensity of her words settle into him like a new truth. He had no idea what to say to that, so instead he simply nodded. What else could he do? His body felt different now, alive in a way it hadn't before. He couldn't quite explain it, but the connection to her, to the land, to everything around him, it was undeniable. Skari gestured for him to rise, her hand extending toward him, and though he had grown accustomed to her physical dominance, there was a tenderness in her gesture now. Callum reached out to take her hand, and for a moment, he felt the pulse of the bond between them, sharp and strong. Come, human. Skari's tone was both an invitation and a command. You are one of us now. You must learn to live among us. Callum's heart was still racing, but he followed her without hesitation. As they moved through the dense jungle, he noticed how she seemed to glide effortlessly, the jungle almost parting before her. Her presence was like a force of nature, an unstoppable power. She was a leader, a warrior, and now she had claimed him. They reached a large clearing, where the other members of Skari's tribe were gathered. Callum's gaze swept over them, taking in their size, their strength, their intensity. These were the people who had been forged in the jungle's unforgiving embrace, the people who had survived through the ages, and now they were his new reality. The tribe's warriors stood in rows, their eyes flicking over Callum as he and Skari approached. He could feel their silent assessment, the weight of their gaze heavy on him. He wasn't sure what they saw, a mere human, weak, out of place, or something more, something Skari had chosen. Welcome, human, said a deep voice from one of the warriors. The speaker was taller than Callum, though not as massive as Skari. His features were sharp, his body rippling with muscle. You will train with us now. You will learn how to survive in our world. Callum met the warrior's gaze, nodding slowly. There was no denying it. This was now his life. The world had changed in ways he didn't fully understand, and he had no choice but to adapt. If he wanted to survive, he would have to embrace it, learn from them, and accept his place in this strange, alien world. Skari stepped forward, placing herself at the front of the tribe. This human is no longer just an outsider. Her voice rang out with authority. He is part of us. His bond with me has been sealed. He will learn our ways and become one of our warriors. The warriors nodded, some with approval, others with skepticism, but none voiced their objections. Callum's heart raced. He was being accepted into this world, not just as a captive, not as a weakling, but as something more. The realization settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had a role to play in this new life, whether he wanted it or not. Skari's gaze turned to him, Her golden eyes filled with a strange emotion. "You are mine, human. But that does not mean you are weak. You have strength in you." She stepped closer, her imposing figure standing just inches from his own. "It is time you learned to use it." The words, spoken with such intensity, stirred something deep inside Callum. He had never considered himself particularly strong. Back on Earth, he had always been just another man. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. But here, in this alien world, something was awakening in him. The bond between him and Skaari wasn't just a connection of bodies. It was a fusing of fates, a merging of strengths and weaknesses. "Follow me, human," Skaari said, leading him toward a large structure at the edge of the clearing. It was a training ground, surrounded by ropes, spears, and other weapons Callum couldn't begin to understand. A dozen warriors stood in formation, practicing with their weapons, their movements fluid and precise. It was a world of discipline, strength, and survival. The training was grueling. Callum's body protested every movement, his muscles screaming in protest, but he pushed through it. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not anymore. As he fought, trained, and learned the ways of his captors, he felt the bond between him and the tribe growing stronger, weaving its way through every fiber of his being. Skaari watched him closely, her sharp eyes tracking his every movement. She was always there, guiding him, pushing him, sometimes with patience, sometimes with frustration. At night, when the fire burned low and the tribe settled into its rhythm, Callum would lie awake, trying to make sense of his new life. The jungle whispered to him now, its sounds, its rhythms, its call. He had become part of it. But that didn't mean he had to accept everything. He didn't have to let Skaari control him, didn't have to let the tribe mold him into someone he wasn't. But somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "Maybe you belong here after all." Callum wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but one thing was certain. He was no longer just a stranger in an alien land. He was part of it now. The bond was unbreakable, and in the heart of this wild, untamed world, he had found a new purpose. With Skaari at his side and the tribe's teachings shaping him, he had to accept it. He was no longer just a human lost in an alien world. He was something more. And for the first time, that realization didn't terrify him. It empowered him.